here's the moment when history and the writing of history actually becomes engaged with historical activism, when those like Anne Scott, who's a well-known historian of women, and also an activist, become engaged in the writing and the doing at the same time. Right. And I say that because it's, of course, characteristic of our generation of women's historians, the first real generation of women's historians in the second wave, that we've talked before about women's history coming out of the community of women's activism. And here, in the ways in which Anne Scott writes about and evokes the memories of Caroline Ware and Pauli Murray, is a great example of that.
And her path-breaking book, Women Have Always Had a History, which was very early in the 60s. Anne Scott is for the women in the South, those of us who went to places like Johns Hopkins, where Willie Lee Rose, who was the first woman who was got a PhD in the history department, and I was the second to follow her. And we were all going to quit because the men were so mean to women, including to Willie Lee Rose. They told her, "You'll never teach." And indeed, her first job was in the Library of Congress. But Willie Lee Rose was such a great historian, she winds up the first woman full-time professor in the history department at Johns Hopkins. But Anne Scott is her mentor. And so, the first person, before, I met Anne Scott because of the civil rights movement before I was at Hopkins, but we became friends because of that. And she really is our mentor.
And perhaps you became a historian because of the civil rights movement, or? Partly
because of the civil rights movement. I always say my life was an accident. I was an athlete and a gymnast, and a boy put a barbell at the end of my mat as I came out of a triple flip, quite by accident. It was a big inner-city varsity thing, and I broke all the muscles and ligaments in my back, and that was the end of my life. And so I majored in anthropology, political science, and history. And the two biggest fellowships I received for graduate school, one was to Johns Hopkins in History and International Relations, and the other was to the University of Pennsylvania in anthropology. And you don't want to get into my personal history, but I chose Hopkins because I thought I'd like to be a military historian and do global work. And then the war in Vietnam broke out, and so we created the Peace History Society, which still exists, hundreds of members in many countries, to do peace as a legitimate study. People only did war as a legitimate study, just as we used to only do men as legitimate studies. So now we have women in the peace movement and the peace movement as legitimate studies. Right. So that was activism. And the civil rights movement is the vertebrae of that.
It's fascinating.
Yes. And Bella was really a big part of it, because when Bella goes to Congress, we then have a great need to get the Freedom of Information Act passed. And this started when I had a syndicated column, and I did a column on Eisenhower, saying all real conservatives should vote for George McGovern, the true heir to Eisenhower's foreign policy. And I was asked to do a book on Eisenhower, and everything I wanted to look at was secret, classified. And so we started to campaign for a Freedom of Information Act. And Bella, then in Congress, puts through what becomes the Freedom of Information Act and the Sunshine Law. So we owe that to Bella. But her origins with Women's Strike for Peace and the Civil Rights Movement, she goes to Mississippi to do cases, and